The Greyhound bus wheezed to a stop at Cedar Falls Modest Station, its brakes hissing through the thick September morning air. Sarah Richardson stepped off into the humid Iowa dawn, her leather messenger bag weighing heavy on her shoulder, though not as heavy as the guilt that had haunted her dreams for 6 years. The cornfields stretched endlessly beyond the town's borders, their golden stalks swaying in an otherworldly dance that made her skin crawl with familiar dread. A cold breeze swept across the platform, carrying with it the scent of earth and something else. Something that reminded her of childhood summers and Tommy's laughter echoing through those very fields. Sarah? Sarah Richardson? She turned to find Mrs. Henderson from the post office, her weathered face creased with surprise and unmistakable pity. The elderly woman's gray hair was pulled back in the same tight bun she'd worn since Sarah was a child, but her eyes held a new wariness that hadn't been there before. "Yes, ma'am, it's me." Sarah forced a smile, pulling her jacket tighter against the sudden chill. "Lord have mercy. I heard you were working for some big newspaper up in Chicago now. What brings you back to our little town?" Mrs. Henderson's voice dropped to a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might disturb something sleeping in the corn. Sarah's throat tightened. How could she explain that she'd quit her job at the Tribune 3 weeks ago when the dreams returned, with a vengeance? How could she tell this kind woman that every morning she woke up hearing Tommy's voice calling her name, pleading with her to come home? Just visiting. Thought it was time. Sarah's breath misted in the air, which seemed odd for September, even in Iowa. The walk down Main Street felt like moving through a town suspended in time. Peterson's Hardware still had the same faded red awning, and the Cedar Falls Diners neon sign flickered with the same broken F that had buzzed throughout her childhood. But something felt different, heavier. The few people she passed on the sidewalk moved quickly, their eyes darting toward the cornfields that surrounded the town like golden walls. Sarah stopped in front of what used to be Miller's grocery store, now boarded up with yellowing newspapers. The headline, visible through the grime, made her heart skip. "Search for missing boy continues. Tommy Richardson still missing after 6 months. Folks don't much like talking about that anymore." She spun around to find Jim Bradley, her old high school classmate, standing behind her. His face had aged beyond his 26 years, etched with lines that spoke of too many sleepless nights. "Jim, I didn't expect to see you here." Sarah studied his face, noting the dark circles under his eyes. "Never left. Someone's got to keep an eye on things." He glanced nervously toward the cornfield visible at the end of the street. "Especially lately." "What do you mean, lately?" Jim shifted uncomfortably, his work boots scraping against the cracked sidewalk. "You haven't heard?" "Course not. Why would the outside papers pick it up? It's just... well, people have been seeing things. In the mist, mostly. Early mornings when the fog rolls in thick from the fields." Sarah's pulse quickened. "What kind of things?" "Shadows that move wrong. Shapes that look like..." He paused, swallowing hard. "Look, I know how it sounds, but 3 different farmers have called the sheriff this month, all saying the same thing. There's a small figure out there, walking the edge of the Hartwell cornfield right around dawn, always in the mist, always gone by the time anyone gets close enough to see clear." The Hartwell cornfield. The same field where Tommy had been playing the day he disappeared. "The sheriff think it's connected to..." "Sheriff Kowalski retired 4 years ago. Couldn't handle the pressure, if you ask me. New guys from Des Moines, doesn't know the history. Treats it like kids playing pranks or people seeing things that ain't there." Jim's voice carried a bitter edge. "But I knew your brother, Sarah, and I'm telling you, what folks are describing, it sounds exactly like Tommy." A gust of wind swept down Main Street, carrying with it the whisper of corn stalks and something else, a sound that might have been a child's voice calling her name. Sarah shivered, pulling her jacket closer. "Where can I find these farmers who saw... whatever they saw?" Jim studied her face for a long moment. "You're not just visiting, are you? You're here about Tommy." Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice. "Old Henderson Farm, about 2 miles north of the Hartwell field. Frank Henderson, Mrs. Henderson's nephew. He was the first to report it. "But Sarah—" Jim grabbed her arm gently as she turned to leave. "Be careful out there. This town's got a long memory, and some things are better left buried." As Sarah walked toward the town's only motel, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her. She glanced back several times, but saw only empty streets and the endless golden ocean of corn swaying in the breeze. Yet with each step, the sensation grew stronger, as if invisible eyes were following her every movement. That night, Sarah lay in the narrow motel bed, listening to the sounds of rural Iowa, the distant hum of insects, the occasional car passing on the highway, and the constant whisper of wind through corn. She'd left the window cracked open, and the thin curtains danced in the cool night breeze. She was just drifting off to sleep when she heard it, a sound that made her blood freeze in her veins. Somewhere in the distance, carried on the wind, came the faint but unmistakable sound of a child laughing, the same laugh that had filled their house for 8 precious years, the same laugh she hadn't heard since that terrible day, 6 years ago. "Tommy?" she whispered into the darkness. The laughter stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence so complete it seemed to press against her eardrums. Sarah sat up in bed, her heart pounding, and looked out the window toward the cornfield visible in the moonlight. For just a moment she could have sworn she saw a small figure standing at the edge of the corn, perfectly still, watching her window. But when she blinked and looked again, there was nothing there but shadows and the endless dance of golden stalks in the Iowa wind. Sarah woke before dawn, her body drenched in cold sweat, and her heart racing from dreams she couldn't quite remember. The only thing that remained was the echo of Tommy's voice calling her name and the overwhelming certainty that he needed her help. She dressed quickly in jeans and boots, grabbed her recorder and notebook, and headed out into the pre-dawn darkness. The Henderson farm sat at the end of a gravel road that seemed to stretch into nowhere, surrounded on 3 sides by towering corn that rustled with an almost musical quality in the morning breeze. The farmhouse itself was a study in rural decay, peeling white paint, a sagging porch, and windows that reflected the pale sky like tired eyes. Frank Henderson was already up, standing on his porch with a steaming mug of coffee and the wary expression of a man who'd seen too much. He was younger than Sarah had expected, maybe 40, with the weathered hands and permanent squint of someone who'd spent his life working the land. "You're the Richardson girl," he said as she approached. It wasn't a question. "Yes, sir, I'm Sarah. I was hoping you might tell me about what you've been seeing in the mornings." Frank studied her for a long moment, then gestured toward 2 old chairs on the porch. "Figured someone would come asking eventually. Just didn't expect it to be you." They sat in the growing light of dawn, and Frank began his story in the measured tones of a man who'd told it several times, but still couldn't quite believe it himself. "Started about 3 weeks ago. I'm always up before sunrise. Livestock don't care what time it is. I was heading out to check on the cattle when I saw something, moving out there in the mist." He pointed toward the cornfield that bordered his property. "At first I thought it was a deer, maybe a lost calf, but the way it moved, too deliberate, too human." Sarah leaned forward, her recorder capturing every word. "Human how?" "Like a child walking. Small steps, arms swinging. And it stayed right at the edge of the corn like it was following the border between my land and the Hartwell field." Frank's voice dropped to a whisper. "The mist was thick that morning, real thick, but I could see the shape clear enough. Small, maybe the size of a 7 or 8-year-old boy." Sarah's breath caught. Tommy had been 8 when he disappeared. "Did you try to get closer?" "Course I did. Grabbed my flashlight and headed out there, calling out in case it was some lost kid. But the strangest thing happened. The closer I got, the thicker the mist became, like it was wrapping around me, making it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. And then what?" Frank set down his coffee mug with shaking hands. "I heard laughing. A child's laugh coming from right ahead of me in the mist. Happy laughing, like a kid playing a game. I called out, 'Hey there, are you lost?' And the laughing stopped. Dead silence. When the mist finally cleared about 10 minutes later, there was nothing there but corn. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. Have you seen it since? Every morning for the past 3 weeks. Same time, same place, same routine. Always in the mist, always gone when the sun burns it off. Frank looked directly at her. I knew your brother, Sarah. Used to see him playing in those fields all the time when your family lived here. And I'm telling you, what I'm seeing out there, it looks exactly like Tommy. As if summoned by his words, a thick mist began to roll across the cornfield, unusual for the warming morning air. Sarah stood up, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and desperate hope. It's happening now, Frank whispered. Look, right there at the tree line. Sarah followed his gaze and felt the world tilt beneath her feet. There, at the edge of the corn where the mist was thickest, stood a small figure. Even through the swirling gray, she could see it was a child, the right height, the right build, wearing clothes that looked familiar in a way that made her chest tight with memory. Without thinking, Sarah stepped off the porch and began walking toward the field. Behind her, she heard Frank calling her name, warning her to be careful, but his voice seemed to come from very far away. All of her attention was focused on the figure in the mist, which had turned toward her as if sensing her approach. The closer she got, the clearer the figure became. It was definitely a boy, maybe 8 years old, with sandy brown hair that stuck up at odd angles just like Tommy's had. He was wearing a red t-shirt and blue jeans, the same clothes Tommy had been wearing the day he disappeared. Tommy? Sarah called softly, afraid that speaking too loudly might make him vanish. The figure tilted its head, and Sarah could swear she saw a smile cross its face. Then it raised one small hand and waved at her. The same silly, exaggerated wave Tommy used to give her when she picked him up from school. Tears streaming down her face, Sarah began to run toward the corn. But the mist seemed to thicken with each step, swirling around her like a living thing. She could barely see her own hands in front of her face, yet somehow she could still see the boy clearly, as if he existed in a different layer of reality. Tommy? Is that really you? She whispered. The boy nodded and pointed toward the corn, not at it but into it, as if indicating something deep within the field. Then he pressed a finger to his lips in the universal gesture for silence and pointed behind Sarah, back toward the farmhouse. Sarah turned and saw Frank Henderson watching from his porch, but when she looked back toward the corn, the boy was gone. The mist began to clear rapidly, as if someone had turned on a giant fan, and within minutes she was standing alone at the edge of an ordinary cornfield under the bright Iowa sun. Did you see him? Sarah called back to Frank, her voice shaking. Frank nodded slowly. Clear as day, but Sarah, did you notice his feet? His feet? They weren't touching the ground. Sarah spent the rest of the morning visiting the other farmers who had reported sightings. Each story was remarkably similar, a small figure appearing in the morning mist at the edge of the Hartwell cornfield, always visible but never reachable, always pointing toward something deeper in the corn before vanishing when the mist cleared. By noon, Sarah was convinced of two things. The figure was definitely Tommy, and he was trying to tell her something important. The question was, what? She drove to the edge of the Hartwell property and parked her rental car on the shoulder of the county road. The cornfield stretched out before her, row upon row of golden stalks that rustled in the breeze with a sound like whispered secrets. Somewhere in there, she was certain, lay the answer to what had happened to her brother. The current owner of the Hartwell farm was an elderly man named George Hartwell, grandson of the original homesteader. He lived in a small house on the far side of the property and, according to the locals, kept to himself since his wife died 5 years earlier. Sarah decided to pay him a visit. The drive to the farmhouse took her down a narrow dirt road that cut straight through the heart of the cornfield. On either side, the corn rose up like walls, blocking out most of the sky and creating a tunnel of green and gold that seemed to stretch into infinity. Sarah had driven this road as a child, but now it felt different. Oppressive, somehow, as if the corn was watching her pass. George Hartwell was working in his garden when she pulled up. his weathered hands pulling weeds with the mechanical precision of someone who'd been doing the same tasks for decades. He looked up as she approached, his pale blue eyes sharp despite his age. "You're one of the Richardson children," he said without preamble. "The older one?" "Yes, sir, Sarah. I was hoping I could ask you a few questions about my brother." George's face hardened. "Nothing to say about that. Told the police everything 6 years ago, and I'll tell you the same thing now. That boy was trespassing on my land, and whatever happened to him didn't happen here. Mr. Hartwell, I'm not trying to blame anyone. I just want to understand." "Understand this," George interrupted, standing up and facing her directly. "That field has been in my family for 4 generations. We've never had any trouble. Never. Hurt anybody, and we don't appreciate being made out to be villains just because some kid wandered off and got himself lost." Sarah noticed that his hands were shaking slightly, and despite his harsh words, there was something in his eyes that looked almost like fear. "The farmers around here have been seeing things in the morning mist. A figure that looks like my brother. Have you noticed anything unusual?" George's face went pale. "Don't know what you're talking about." But Sarah caught the way his eyes flicked toward the cornfield and then back to her face. He was lying, and they both knew it. "Mr. Hartwell, if you know something, anything about what happened to Tommy, please tell me. I'm not looking to cause trouble. I just want to bring my brother home." For a moment, George's expression softened, and Sarah thought he might open up to her. But then his face hardened again, and he turned back to his garden. "Nothing to tell. Now I'd appreciate it if you'd leave my property." That evening, Sarah sat in the motel room, reviewing her notes and the recordings from the day. Every instinct she'd developed as a journalist told her that George Hartwell knew more than he was saying, but more importantly, every instinct she had as Tommy's sister told her that her brother was trying to communicate with her, trying to lead her to something important. As the sun set and the mist began to form over the cornfield visible from her window, Sarah made a decision. Tomorrow morning, she would follow Tommy into the corn, no matter what she found there. Sarah woke at 4:30 a.m., dressed in dark clothes, and drove back to the Henderson farm in the pre-dawn darkness. She parked a quarter-mile away and walked through the fields, using her phone's flashlight to navigate the uneven ground. The mist was already forming as she reached the edge of the Hartwell cornfield, thick and otherworldly in the pale light of approaching dawn. She didn't have to wait long. As the sun crested the horizon, the familiar small figure materialized, in the mist, exactly where she'd seen it the day before. This time Sarah was close enough to see details that made her heart ache with recognition. The cowlick in Tommy's hair that never stayed down, the way he stood with one foot slightly ahead. Of the other, the faded Superman logo on his red t-shirt. "Tommy," she whispered, and the figure turned toward her with a smile that was heartbreakingly familiar. This time, when he pointed toward the corn and began walking into the field, Sarah followed without hesitation. The mist seemed to part for her, creating a clear path while remaining thick everywhere else. She could see Tommy clearly about 10 feet ahead, glancing back occasionally to make sure she was following, just like he used to do when they played hide-and-seek in their backyard. The deeper they went into the cornfield, the stranger the world became. The mist took on an almost luminescent quality, and Sarah could hear sounds that didn't belong in rural Iowa. Distant children's laughter, the sound of a baseball hitting a glove, a mother's voice calling someone in for dinner. It was as if she were walking through layers of memory, past and present blending together in the supernatural fog. Tommy led her through a maze of corn rows, turning left and right with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where he was going. Sarah tried to keep track of their path, but the mist and the endless rows of identical corn made it impossible. She was completely dependent on her brother's guidance. After what felt like hours but could have been minutes, Tommy stopped in a small clearing where the corn had been cleared away years ago. In the center of the clearing was an old well, its stone walls covered with moss and its wooden cover rotted and partially collapsed. Tommy pointed down into the well and then looked at Sarah with an expression of infinite sadness. Sarah approached the well cautiously, her heart pounding. She used her phone's flashlight to peer down into the darkness below. The well was deeper than she'd expected, and it took a moment for her eyes to adjust to the beam of light. When they did, she stumbled backward with a gasp. At the bottom of the well, perhaps 20 feet down, lay a small skeleton wearing the rotted remains of red fabric. "Oh, Tommy," Sarah whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Oh, baby, what happened to you?" She turned back to where Tommy had been standing, but the clearing was empty except for wisps of fading mist. For the first time since the apparitions began, she was completely alone in the cornfield. Sarah called 911 from her cell phone, though the signal was weak deep in the corn. It took her nearly an hour to guide the emergency responders back to the clearing, and by then, the mist had completely cleared, leaving only bright Iowa sunshine and the grim reality of what she'd found. Sheriff Mike Torres was a compact man, in his 40s with kind eyes and the careful manner of someone who'd dealt with too many tragic situations. He supervised the recovery of the remains while Sarah gave her statement to Deputy Walsh, a young woman who seemed genuinely sympathetic to Sarah's situation. "Can you tell me again how you found this location?" Deputy Walsh asked, her pen poised over her notepad. Sarah had prepared for this question, knowing that the truth would sound insane. "I've been walking through the cornfield every morning, looking for any sign of what might have happened to my brother. This morning I noticed this clearing and decided to investigate. It wasn't entirely a lie, but it wasn't the whole truth either." Deputy Walsh seemed to accept the explanation, though Sarah caught her exchanging a glance with the sheriff that suggested they found her story a bit convenient. Dr. Emily Chen, the county coroner, arrived 2 hours later to oversee the removal of the remains. She was a small, precise woman who worked with the reverent care of someone who understood she was handling not just evidence, but the mortal remains of someone's beloved child. "Preliminary examination suggests the remains have been here for several years," Dr. Chen told Sheriff Torres, her voice low enough that Sarah had to strain to hear. "Cause of death will have to wait for the full autopsy, but there's no obvious trauma to the bones. Could have been accidental. Children fall into wells all the time in rural areas." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. If Tommy had simply fallen into the well accidentally, why had George Hartwell seemed so afraid when she questioned him? And why had no one found this clearing during the extensive search 6 years ago? "Sheriff Torres," Sarah approached him, as the coroner's team prepared to transport the remains. "I'd like to ask George Hartwell some more questions." "That's our job, Ms. Richardson. I understand this is personal for you, but he lied to me yesterday. He knows something about this place, about what happened to Tommy. As a journalist, I have experience with people who are hiding information." Sheriff Torres studied her face for a moment. "What kind of journalist?" "I used to work for the Chicago Tribune. Crime reporting, mostly." "Used to?" Sarah hesitated. "I took a leave of absence to come back here and look for answers about my brother." The sheriff nodded slowly. "Tell you what, we're going to interview Hartwell this afternoon anyway. You can observe, but you don't participate. Deal?" That afternoon, Sarah sat in a corner of George Hartwell's kitchen while Sheriff Torres and Deputy Walsh questioned the elderly farmer. George had agreed to the interview but seemed nervous, his hands shaking as he poured coffee for his uninvited guests. "Mr. Hartwell," Sheriff Torres began, "we found the remains of a child in an old well on your property today. The well was hidden in a clearing deep in your cornfield. Were you aware of its existence?" George's face went even paler than it had been when Sarah questioned him. "Course I knew about it. It's my land, ain't it? That well's been there since my grandfather's time, maybe longer. Why didn't you mention it when Tommy Richardson disappeared 6 years ago? The search teams covered your entire property, but somehow they missed this clearing." "Because—" George set down his coffee cup with shaking hands. "Because I told them not to search there." The room fell silent except for the ticking of an old grandfather clock in the corner. "Why would you do that, Mr. Hartwell?" Deputy Walsh asked gently. George looked at Sarah, then back at the officers. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Because I saw what happened to that boy, and I was too much of a coward to tell anyone." Sarah gripped the arms of her chair, her heart pounding. "Tommy Richardson was playing in my corn that day, just like he did most afternoons when school let out. I told him before to stay out of there. Corn can be dangerous for little kids, easy to get lost, but he never listened. That day I was working on my tractor near the edge of the field when I heard him screaming." George paused, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. "By the time I got to him, he'd already fallen into the well. The wooden cover was old, rotted, through. Must have looked solid enough to step on, but it gave way under his weight. I could hear him crying down there, calling for help." "Why didn't you call for help immediately?" Sheriff Torres asked, though his tone remained gentle. "Because I panicked. I knew everyone would blame me for letting him play on my land, for not keeping the well properly covered. I'd been meaning to fix that cover for months, but I kept putting it off. If I'd just taken care of it when I should have—" George broke, down completely, sobbing into his hands. "I climbed down into that well with a rope, thinking I could get him out myself, but when I got down there, he wasn't moving anymore. Must have hit his head on the way down, or—" He shook his head. "I checked for a pulse, for breathing. Nothing. He was gone." Sarah felt tears streaming down her face, but she remained silent as George continued his confession. "I know I should have called the police then, should have reported it as an accident, but I was scared. Scared everyone would think I did it on purpose, scared I'd lose my farm, scared of spending my last years in prison for something that was just a terrible accident. So I covered up the well entrance with brush and corn stalks, made it look like it had always been hidden. When the search teams came, I told them that part of the field was dangerous, that there were hidden holes and they should search elsewhere first." "And they believed you," Deputy Walsh said quietly. "They trusted me. I've lived here my whole life, never caused any trouble. They figured I knew my own land better than anyone." George looked directly at Sarah. "I am so sorry. I know that doesn't make it right. But I am truly, deeply sorry. That guilt has been eating me alive for 6 years." Sheriff Torres leaned forward. "Mr. Hartwell, you're going to need to come with us to make a formal statement. There will likely be charges filed." George nodded, seeming almost relieved. "I understand. I should have done this years ago." As they prepared to leave, George turned to Sarah one last time. "Miss Richardson, I want you to know, your brother wasn't scared at the end. When I found him, he looked peaceful, like he was just sleeping." George's voice broke. "And these past few weeks, with all the strange sightings people have been reporting, I think maybe he was trying to make sure the truth came out, trying to bring you here so you could take him home." That evening, Sarah sat by the window of her motel room, watching the sun set over the cornfield. The remains had been positively identified as Tommy's through dental records, and Dr. Chen had confirmed that the cause of death was consistent with George's account, a tragic accident made worse by one man's fear and cowardice. As darkness fell and the first wisps of mist began to form over the corn, Sarah found herself whispering into the gathering dusk. "I found you, Tommy. I'm going to take you home now." For a moment she could have sworn she saw a small figure standing at the edge of the cornfield, but this time it wasn't sad or desperate. This time it looked peaceful. The figure raised one small hand in what might have been a wave goodbye, and then faded into the mist like a breath on a cold morning. 3 weeks later, Sarah stood in Graceland Cemetery in Chicago, watching as Tommy's small casket was lowered into the ground next to their grandmother's grave. Their parents had flown in from Florida, their faces aged by grief, but somehow lighter, now that they finally had answers. The service was small, just family and a few close friends who remembered the bright, energetic boy Tommy had been. Pastor Williams from their old church spoke about the mystery of God's plan and the comfort of knowing that Tommy was finally at peace. Sarah barely heard the words. Her attention was focused on the simple headstone they'd chosen, engraved with Tommy's name, his dates, and a single line: "Beloved son and brother, forever 8 years old." As the service concluded and people began to drift away, Sarah remained by the grave, her hand resting on the cool granite of the headstone. Her parents approached, her mother's arms wrapping around her in the first truly comfortable embrace they'd shared since Tommy's disappearance. "Thank you," her mother whispered. "Thank you for bringing him home." "I had help," Sarah replied softly, though she didn't elaborate. After her parents left to catch their flight back to Florida, Sarah spent another hour at the cemetery, telling Tommy about everything that had happened since she'd found him. George Hartwell had been charged with failure to report a death and interfering with a police investigation, but the judge had been lenient, sentencing him to community service and probation in recognition of his age and genuine remorse. He'd sold his farm to a development company and moved to a retirement community in Iowa City, finally free from the guilt that had consumed him for 6 years. "I got my job back at the Tribune," Sarah told the headstone. "Turns out, taking a leave of absence to solve a cold case actually impressed my editor. Who knew?" She smiled through her tears. "I'm going to keep looking for missing kids, Tommy. There are so many families out there who need answers, who need to know what happened to their children. Maybe I can help some of them the way you helped me." As the sun began to set, Sarah felt a presence beside her, warm and comforting, like someone sitting next to her on the bench. She didn't turn to look, but she could swear she smelled the familiar scent of Tommy's strawberry shampoo and the faint odor of corn silk that always clung to his clothes after he'd been playing in the fields. "I love you, little brother," she whispered. "Rest well." A gentle breeze stirred the flowers on the grave, and Sarah felt an overwhelming sense of peace wash over her. For the first time in 6 years, the guilt that had weighed on her heart began to lift. She hadn't been there to protect Tommy when he needed her, but she had been there to find him and bring him home. Sometimes that had to be enough. 6 months later, Sarah was working at her desk in the Tribune newsroom when her phone rang. The caller ID showed a number from Pocahontas County, Iowa. "Sarah Richardson? This is Sheriff Martinez from Pocahontas County. I got your number from Sheriff Torres down in Cedar Falls. He said you might be able to help us with something." Sarah leaned back in her chair, already reaching for her notebook. "What's the situation, Sheriff? We've got a missing child case here. Little girl named Emma Chen disappeared 3 days ago. Her parents are convinced she's still alive, but we're running out of leads. Sheriff Torres mentioned you had some unusual insights when you found your brother. Said you might be willing to take a look at our case." Sarah thought about Tommy, about the morning mist and the figure in the cornfield that had led her to the truth. She thought about all the families still waiting for answers, still hoping for closure. "I'll be there tomorrow morning," she said. As she hung up the phone and began packing her travel bag, Sarah felt that familiar presence again, warm and encouraging, like a hand on her shoulder giving her strength. She smiled, knowing that Tommy would always be with her now, not as a desperate spirit trapped between worlds, but as a loving brother helping her find her purpose. Outside the Tribune building, the Chicago wind carried the scent of approaching rain and something else, something that reminded her of Iowa cornfields and summer afternoons filled with laughter. Sarah took a deep breath, shouldered her bag, and headed out to help another family find their way home. In the distance, barely visible in the late afternoon haze, a small figure waved goodbye from the corner of State and Madison before dissolving into the crowd like mist in the morning sun. The end author's note: this story explores themes of guilt, redemption, and the unbreakable bonds between siblings. While incorporating supernatural elements, it maintains focus on the human drama of loss, the search for truth, and the healing power of closure. The cornfields of Iowa serve as both a literal setting and a metaphorical space where the boundary between the living and the dead becomes permeable, allowing love to transcend even death itself.